What's up, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of the Falcons Final Whistle podcast, presented by, as you can see, Zaxby's. And we are doing this not directly after a game and on an audio-only podcast. We're in video with 3 cameras and enough Zaxby's to feed the entire digital department. Thank you so much to Zaxby's for making a special delivery as we discuss the first 4 games of the Atlanta Falcons season.
Yeah, I haven't eaten lunch today, so this is really coming in clutch for me personally. Mm-hmm. So hopefully let's get into this so that I can eat something.
Yeah, I'm just Calsey's the middle one. I'm just gonna go ahead and gorge. Everybody else can. Calsey's, yeah, that's right. So let's get into the first 4 games of the Falcons season so we can get back to eating. And they're sitting at a 2-2 record at this point. They beat the Carolina Panthers out of the gate 24-10. They had a huge comeback in the fourth quarter, beating the Green Bay Packers 25-24. Lost to the Lions 20-6, and lost to the Jaguars on Sunday in London 23-7. 2 really positive results at home. 2 results that I'm sure the Falcons would like to have back, both of them on the road, the first in Detroit and the second one at Wembley Stadium. If you were to say before the season, hey, they played 3 legitimate playoff contenders and the Panthers, and they came out of it 2-2.
And the Panthers.
Yeah, and the Panthers, right? They're in their own category.
Took a shot.
I did. Okay, back on track. If you would have said that they were 2-2 after playing that level of competition, you'd probably take that. As I wrote in the column after the Jaguars game, I don't know if that's so positive, because I feel like the Falcons are better and maybe should have played better. I'm not saying that they automatically would have beat Jacksonville or Detroit, but could have and probably should have played better. They haven't played their best football yet. A bunch of Falcons have said that. What are y'all's impressions of the Falcons as we sit past what is not really the quarter pole anymore, but through 4 games at 500?
You want me to go?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think it's interesting that it's 2-0 at home and then 0-2 on the road, because that tracks with Desmond Ridder's record alone as a quarterback. But when it comes to the Falcons as a whole, it didn't look like the same team in week 3 or 4 compared to 1 and 2. You had the fourth quarter comeback that was everyone hoping the team was going to look like that through all 4 quarters rather than just at the end. And you could see resilience there with their backs against the wall. They were able to string together, as they keep saying, complementary football. But then it just wasn't there against the Lions or even the Jaguars. So if they can get back to 1 and 2, at least that's a better start. They want to be better than even 1 and 2, but you don't want to go downhill from here. You don't want to go into a losing record. Like, it needs to either stay split even or get better. It's not going to stay split even because we're coming on an odd number, but it's a slippery slope, I think.
Yeah, my thing is that, like, if I go back to what I felt in training camp and kind of in the weeks leading up to the start of the season and what I felt like this team was advertised as, I thought that this defense, let's start with the defense. This defense was advertised as an attacking and aggressive defense. I feel like we have seen that through 4 games from this defense. I've actually been very pleased with what I've seen from this defense. They have been able to keep Falcons in games and I think within striking distance within those first 2 games. Do they have moments where, yeah, they give up an explosive or they let a quarterback leak out? Absolutely. But when push comes to shove and in the moments that matter, I feel like this defense has consistently shown up in these first 4 games. So in terms of the advertising, this defense is as advertised, in my opinion, so far. This offense is not. And for me, when I was kind of looking at this offense going into this season, I remember, and this was something that I wrote about in the post game, and it's this whole when we were on our way back from London, it's this idea that this Falcons offense was supposed to be fun and entertaining and explosive, and the issues that we've seen over the first 4 games are issues that I do agree with you that there is kind of this whole idea of the first 2 games have looked differently than the last 2 games. But in my opinion, if we're just looking at this offense, the issues that this offense has had, they've had from week 1. They have protection issues. There are some issues with, I think, sometimes Desmond Ridder's decision making. This offense is not producing explosive plays all that much, and they're not scoring touchdowns. And I think for me, that's what's been disappointing, is because you go into training camp and you see all of these weapons. The Falcons have their last 3 first-round picks have been offensive weapons that are kind of these very dynamic and exciting players. I mean, we can talk about Bijan Robinson and what he's done through his first 4 games all day long, but I need more from this offense than to only score 1 touchdown in the last 2 games. That's tough. I know we're going to get into the issues with them starting early and starting fast, but these are all issues that I feel like are a complete disconnect from what I thought this offense was going to be going into the first of the season. And I think that's kind of true to what we've heard players say as well. I mean, Drake London said after the loss in London against Jacksonville, it's like, he was asked the question, I think, along the lines of, what's holding this offense back? And he said, maybe ourselves. Maybe we need to look in the mirror and figure things out. And I think that's exactly what needs to happen as we're looking forward into the next, 4 or 5 games of a stint.
Yeah, and I think we're going to go over what the Falcons have done well and maybe some pain points and in terms of things that they can do better. And we're obviously going to evaluate quarterback Desmond Ridder. But before we get there, let's address a pretty awesome deal that Zaxby's has going that fans have been able to take advantage of twice already at home games. If the Falcons defense sacks the opposing quarterback at home, you can go to any Atlanta area Zaxby's for a buy one, get one Big Zax snack meal the day after the game. And if you go to or just watch the Falcons game against Houston at home on Sunday, if they get a sack, use the code ATLSAC23 on Monday to get your BOGO deal, which sounds like a good thing. So let's kind of stay on this defensive theme in terms of what has gone well. They haven't generated a ton of sacks necessarily to this point, but I think Tori's point is great. When it matters most, this defense generally stands up. You look at that Jacksonville game, after Desmond Ridder's second interception, that game could have completely come unglued. The Jaguars have the ball in the red zone.
Yeah.
Not only do they get a stop on 3rd down, but Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata get a stop on 4th down, so there's no points. And we saw that time and again against Green Bay, right? And
I think even in Detroit, that 3rd quarter.
100% kept them in the game. And I think that when you look at it, I mean, I'm going to bring up Jesse Bates, obviously, because he's been involved in 4 takeaways to this point and forced another fumble, I think.
Yes.
And he's been as advertised. David Onyemata has been awesome in the middle. Bud Dupree we saw come on a little bit against Jacksonville, and I think that they need more of that off the edge. But overall, you're right. They've given up a couple of explosives that they would like to have back. But I think overall this defense has been steady. And I bring this up all the time. Charles Woodson once told me that if a defense gives up less than 24 points, you should win that football game. They've done their job. And the Falcons, by that metric, have done their job every single game to this point. And I think that a continuation of them playing in sync, understanding what they're doing, I think can only make this defense better as we move forward.
Their stamina is there, too, because as we already mentioned, the offensive woes, they're getting on and off the field, and the defense is spending more time on the field. That fact that they're able to withstand that level of play that often is good news for them moving forward. It's just, I mean, it's not ideal, obviously. They don't want to be on the field all the time, but they're getting the job done when they're out there.
My thing, too, is that, this actually isn't – this whole idea of keeping opponents, what you consider to be low scoring in the NFL – this is actually even a carryover from last season. Right. If you think about the last, I want to say 8 games, there were very few times, if hardly any at all, that there were more than 21, 20, let's say 25 points scored against this defense. And that's with a completely different look defense, a completely different coordinator. The fact that has carried over into 2023 with new pieces and everything, that to me just speaks to a culture that has been built in Atlanta around the defense. And that's something that, I don't know, I think it's really cool to see, and something that we haven't talked about in Atlanta for a long time is how consistent this defense has been.
Yeah, and that's a positive, and I think that they can still improve in terms of those game-changing plays, in terms of getting sacks and creating more takeaways, but the steadiness has been impressive. I think Jeff Okudah in his first extensive playing time against Jacksonville looked like the athlete that the Falcons hoped that he would be. Somehow Nate Landman has stepped in when Troy Anderson got hurt early, and I think overall this group looks good, and I'm sure that they would even say can do even better.
Yeah, there's more out on the table for this defense. I know we're kind of being like, oh, they're so steady and they're so consistent, but there is a lot still left for this group to do. You want more takeaways. You want to limit those explosives. I think, going back to even the Green Bay game, those key penalties and pass interference calls, like you want to limit those. I think that there is a lot left for this defense to do and aspire to be, but so far they've done enough, in my opinion, to set up the offense in really good, consistent ways, and the offense hasn't answered.
The defense is so new, too. I mean, we're talking so highly about them, and this is a unit that has a bunch of new pieces, a new defensive coordinator, so the fact that they've been able to put it together so quickly is impressive in and of itself.
Yeah.
Because you're saying the thing that carried over from last season is that low scoring of opponents. Well, that's the only thing that basically carried over here, because it's a different look defense.
Right.
Yeah, and the thing, if you go over the last two games, which were both losses, and you talk about this new scheme and coming together, the two of the touchdowns that have been allowed by this defense were an explosive to Sam Laporta in Detroit that looked like a busted coverage or a miscommunication.
Yep.
I think the same thing can be said of Calvin Ridley's touchdown in Jacksonville. AJ's never that far from somebody unless there's a miscommunication about help. So those things I think are fixable. We're not talking about talent issues. AJ got torched. That's not what we're saying. That's not what's happening here. And I think that that's another sign of optimism, because to Terrin's point, they're going to figure those things out. Now, another positive is obviously Bijan Robinson. There was a great quote from Arthur Smith in Monday's virtual press conference where he said that he plays and looks like Allen Iverson sometimes. Yeah. And our amazing digital team kind of did like a merger sort of a thing of AI crossover, and then Robinson embarrassing a Jaguars linebacker, and he has that type of ability. He's so fun to watch. 53 carries, 318 yards. He's gone over 100 twice, 19 receptions for 134. The guy's been really good.
Yeah.
He's just breaking records or like notching himself in the history book for the Falcons already 4 games in, because I know with Falcons takeoff each week, it's like, oh, all right,
what did Bijan do?
What did Bijan do this week? What
Yeah.
can be my stellar stat number 1?
Right, yeah.
And it's literally because he is performing on the field, and he's basically doing exactly what the Falcons expected to do when they drafted him in the first round. He's they're getting their money's worth out of him.
Right.
So many words there.
No, but you're so right. And I think like it's really cool too, just from a personal standpoint of getting to meet Bijan Robinson. And I think we've all had conversations with Bijan. This is a very genuine human being and someone who I actually
very much so
like being around. And I think that goes to something that we've heard offensive linemen say, where they're like, he's slowly, but not even slowly, quickly. He's quickly becoming someone that we can trust, and we like blocking for him, and we like being around him. And I actually remember a couple weeks ago, I think it was after the Green Bay game, I was talking to Dwayne Ledford, who's the Falcons offensive line coach, and I brought that up, and I asked him, I was like, what is it about Bijan that, allows this offensive line and probably the offense as a whole to feel like they can trust him and feel good about blocking for him? He's like, because he makes things happen when they're not supposed to happen. He creates things that aren't there. He creates opportunities that just aren't there. And so if you are a lineman blocking for him, if you're out wide as a receiver blocking for him, you kind of feel really good that even if you're not 100% doing your job, like, he's going to make something happen. And we've seen it time and time again. And I think it goes to your point too. The Falcons drafted Bijan Robinson with the number 8 overall pick in this year's draft. And he's exactly what they drafted. Every conversation that I feel like we had with scouts during the draft process was like, when you see him in person, he feels different. He feels like the best player on the field every time he stepped on the field for Texas. We're 4 games in, and it feels that way for the Falcons too.
one thing that his teammates say, because you mentioned how they're saying he's quickly becoming a huge part of the offense, the part that stands out to me most is whenever they say he's someone you want to root for.
Right.
That goes with what he's able to do, his personality combined.
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, he's an impressive player. It's like he's an impressive person. Like that is a genuine dude in the locker room.
Yeah.
And I think it's somebody that you want as a public face of your franchise,
You do.
too. And I think that when you make a heavy investment at number 8 overall, this is the type of return, this is the type of character that you want. And I think that, and he has this on some running backs who are elusive still get hit like flush, right? Like some running backs take a pounding. I wouldn't necessarily say that Bijan gets hit like that, and I think over a longer haul, that's going to help him. I'm not saying that he doesn't take hits every time he touches the ball, but I'm saying that they are glancing blows sometimes. So he's been really good, but you don't get to 2-2 by just being good at everything. There are pain points. We've already kind of talked about some of them, but let's take a deeper dive into. Let's do slow starts first, so then we can talk about the passing game and Desmond Ridder together.
My turn.
So we can introduce a new segment to
I don't
the
even know what to
Falcons
call
Final
it,
Whistle. It's a working title, but we can at least temporarily call it Talking Nerdy with Terrin. And so
that was a joke.
well, now it's out there
Now
on the record.
Now it's been recorded.
Cozy.
But yeah, so Terrin is our resident statistician.
Yes.
And please read Falcons Takeoff and the Wednesday dailies to dive into the numbers. And in addition, in podcast form, we're going to get into what has been an issue in wins and losses. The Falcons have not started fast in any of these 4 games, and it's put them in a bind. They've been able to overcome it sometimes and sometimes not.
Well, we'll start just listing off their first drives offensively. Week 1 against Carolina, they had 3 plays for a net of -6 yards and punted it away. Against Green Bay, they had 3 plays for 16 yards. It ended in an interception. That was their first down that they picked up. Week 3, 3 plays, 8 yards, punted. Week 4, 3 plays, 9 yards, punted. So they're not getting going at all. And it's like the first 3 they passed on their first down. It wasn't until this past weekend where they ran the ball for the first time. I don't know if that's a trend or whatever, but decisions there are being made. And it's like, even when you go bigger picture with the first quarter versus the overall game, I mean, last week they had 5 net yards in the first quarter.
Yeah.
They finished with 287. That means they were averaging around 94 offensive yards per quarter in the third, fourth, and second. I went out of order with those numbers.
Yeah.
Outside the first.
But outside the first, yeah. And it's just like, you can't do that. And when the opponents weren't doing all that much better. No one has scored against the Falcons on their first offensive drive. But again, none of them are undefeated either. So when you look at the 2 undefeated teams.
For those just listening, she just flipped her entire page over.
When you look at the 2 undefeated teams in the NFL right now, the Eagles and the 49ers, Eagles, first drive, week 1, field goal. Week 2, field goal. Week 3, turned over on downs, but they picked up a lot of yards. So it's not like it was 3 and out, a dud. Week 4, touchdown. The 49ers, week 1, touchdown. Week 2, touchdown. Week 3, field goal. Week 4, touchdown.
Yep.
There's a reason these teams are undefeated. Because once you get the ball going and get the game rolling, it's harder to stop than it is to start.
Yeah. Well, something that's really interesting, too, it's funny because I think Terrin and I, we also live together. We're roommates, and we work together. We see each other a lot. And I feel like what Terrin does is so cool in terms of how she sees stats and how she can break them down and look at them. I feel like I'm the opposite. I focus a lot on the words that are being used. And I say this because I think that we actually can work off of each other in this extent, because something that Arthur Smith said after Detroit was that the Falcons didn't have a counterpunch. That was the word he used. He was like, against Green Bay and against Carolina, we had a counterpunch. There was no counterpunch in Detroit. Well, there was also no counterpunch in London against the Jags, but he didn't use the word counterpunch. He used jump start. That's a word in his last 2 press conferences, he's probably used 15 times.
Yeah.
The word jump start.
Using jumper cables.
Right. And I think, to your point about, it's not necessarily like that they needed a counterpunch. They've gotten to the point now where they need to jumpstart the offense quickly in their very first drive. And that's something that, to me, is that's what's standing in the way of this offense being what it knows it can be and what it wants to be, is the ability to get this thing going in the first quarter. I mean, the stats speak for themselves. The first quarter has been a pain point for this offense. And against good teams, like not saying that Green Bay and Carolina aren't good teams, but against
Scott did about Carolina.
Right, yeah. But against the Lions and Jaguars, you couldn't ever get to the point where you felt like you could right the ship because they just kind of took the game away from you. And I think like that's the difference between the first 2 games and the second 2 games of this 4-game stint that we're talking about, is that like they were able to overcome the issues that they had in the starts against Carolina and Green Bay, but they weren't against the Lions and the Jaguars. And so I think for me, it's like these are issues that have been issues for 4 games. How do you fix that when something has been an issue every single game? That's the challenge that this coaching staff, the challenge that this offense has in front of them as they're about to get into games against the Texans. And who's after the Texans?
The Commanders.
The Commanders. So you have opportunities ahead of you. You've got to right the ship, because if you don't do it now, it's going to be really tough in the weeks ahead.
Well, the difference between the first 2 games and the second 2 games, going back to the notebook real quick, was they weren't behind after the first quarter.
Right.
Against Carolina, it was 0-0 entering the second. Against the Packers, it was 3-0 for the Falcons. But then in week 4 and week 3, they were down heading into the second quarter already. When you look at the undefeated teams again, they're up in every single game come the second quarter.
Yeah.
Like, it's just...
Yeah, I think
how do you fix that?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is these elite teams that we're talking about, the 49ers and Eagles belong in that category. They are applying pressure early. The Falcons are absorbing pressure, some of it from the opponent and some of it from themselves. A common question in the locker room in London was, and even to Arthur Smith in his press conferences, are they pressing early, right? That the longer this continues, the more it becomes both an execution and a mental thing, right? And they insist that they're not, but it's one of those things where you need confidence to be gleaned from a positive start. And I think that if you jump up, then you feel like, okay, because we saw when the Falcons were up, and I know this is Carolina again, but when the Falcons were up 2 scores, that pass rush came alive because they had opportunities. So let's give the defense an opportunity to do what it does best. And when you're in a negative game script, guess what isn't as effective? Your run game.
Yeah.
100%.
And that's the thing, is that to your point about them working from behind the last 2 games, it's like you're in obvious passing down situations in these last 2 games against all of the names, the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Detroit Lions. You're in obvious passing down situations. Everybody's like, well, why aren't they running the ball? Why aren't they running the ball? Because they don't have time. You can't bleed the clock like what they did against Carolina in running the ball. Like, so you're getting away from the bread and butter and the foundation of what this offense has notoriously done well, which is put the ball on the ground and run it.
So that brings us to the other pain point. We can just lump in passing game efficiency and Desmond Ridder's performance through 4 games.
Yeah.
Desmond Ridder will be the starting quarterback in week 5.
Yes.
I don't think there was ever a huge doubt about
Apparently
that.
there was.
Yeah, I mean, Arthur Smith was definitely asked about it. So how do we evaluate the passing game to this point? It hasn't been as good as it needs to be. At some points, the passing game is going to have to go win you a ball game, and it really hasn't done that yet.
There are a few kinks, I think, in the armor of the passing game.
I think that's a good word, yeah.
And I think that when I look at this passing game, I can't just put it on Desmond Ridder. I can't just put it on the offensive line protecting. I can't just put it on the routes being run or anything like that. It's collectively, this passing game collectively needs to be better. And I go back to the Detroit game where everybody's talking about the 7 sacks, and it's like, okay.
It was a lot.
Well, the point that I was going to make was that, like, everybody's talking about the protection, and even Arthur Smith was like, there was probably 1, maybe 2 times that Desmond Ridder held the ball for too long, but, like, we got to be better in pass protecting situations. Well, then in London, it's like Desmond Ridder was sacked 4 times, and there were probably some issues that it probably was more so on his his part and we go back even to the very, very first week of the season against Carolina where Arthur Smith was talking about like spacing and timing issues in the routes. It's not just like a one problem. You bring in Taylor Heineke and for the fans calling for Taylor Heineke to come in for Desmond Ridder at quarterback. It's like, I don't think you make that switch and it automatically fixes the entire passing game and the offense is just firing on all cylinders. That's not at all what I think would happen because the issues are at every single level. And I believe that from conversations that we've had with coaches, conversations that we've had with players, that's how they feel too.
You saw glimpses of the offense getting into a rhythm in those first 2 games, and I feel like those glimpses are gone. And that's where the sack count has gone up and the score has gone down. Mm-hmm. It's just like production down, something else up.
Right, yeah.
Something negative up.
Right,
like,
yeah.
It's just you kept talking about the rhythm in the first game, the rhythm in the second game. It's like we got it in the fourth quarter, and it's like that's why they were able to come back.
Yeah.
But that's not there. Mm-hmm. Maybe they got too comfortable thinking they could come back. It's like, oh, when our back's against the wall, we start firing all cylinders and we're good. Well, what if your back doesn't reach the wall? What if you're already too far behind? You're in a different room.
Yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately, that's what has happened over the last couple games. And I think Tori's point is a great one. It's not simply exchanging one player for another. And it's funny because a lot of people are saying, well, Desmond Ridder's putting the ball in harm's way too often, right? And it's leading to turnovers. Well,
that's just recently too, though.
Yeah, and you're right. Over the last couple games, well, Taylor Heineke puts the ball in harm's way a lot as well because he's going for it. He's trying to put the pressure on, and I think I don't think it's doom and gloom because, as we mentioned with the defense, this is not a talent problem. It's not like you look at the depth chart and you're like, well the Falcons aren't going to be able to put this together.
And that's the reason why I feel differently at 2-2 at this point in the season this year than I did at 2-2 at this point in the season last year.
Right.
I feel very different about where the Falcons are because of the level of talent that I do feel like they have. They had money, they pumped money into it. They have draft capital, they pumped draft capital into it. I mean, I truly feel very different about the construction of this team.
Yeah, and I think because of that, when you look at the offensive line, there are talented athletes up there. We've talked about these skill players. Let's not forget, right, that Kyle Pitts tore a ligament in his knee last November.
Right.
Okay, those things take time to recover explosiveness and burst. And you've got Drake London with 2 touchdowns. The weapons are here, and I think to piggyback off of what you were saying is that because the talent is here, I think the scheme's pretty good. So it's just a matter of getting everything linked up so all the wires are sending electricity in the right direction.
Wow.
My analogy is really
for the jump start.
Yeah.
For the jump
Yeah.
start.
Wow.
I didn't mean for that to tie together, but it sort of did.
This is my car background.
I don't know anything about cars.
So now we're heading towards, and it's funny because the first sentence of my column from Sunday is that the Falcons just wrapped up their most difficult/competitive stretch, right? That they had Green Bay, which is pretty good. Detroit and Jacksonville, I believe, are very good.
Again, letting Carolina slide.
Yeah, well, 0-4 is 0-4. But it's funny because another one of these, well, before the season, when you face Houston, Washington, Tampa, and Tennessee, you look at that and you're like, well, that should be a walk in the park and maybe 4-0. And then all of a sudden, C.J. Stroud looks like an ace pitcher.
That's the thing.
Sam Howell makes incredible throws. Baker Mayfield is in a career renaissance, and now Derrick Henry's throwing touchdown passes.
My thing is like this Houston Texans game for the last few years, you were to circle this game and be like, all right, W.
Yeah, W, automatic.
But this Houston Texans team is coming into Atlanta probably feeling as good as they've felt in a long time. And that matters in terms of what you were saying,
play 'em, yeah.
Like in terms of confidence, like building confidence. This is a Houston Texas team that probably feels pretty dang good.
Yeah, so there is difficulty ahead. You can't just waltz right past these teams anymore, especially with what we've seen. Even if they're 500 or around that, these teams have all played pretty well. They all have talent, and you're going to have to figure it out quickly. So
it is a week-by-week league.
Yeah.
But the next 2 are home. Do we think the Falcons are going to stick to this home winning scheme?
I mean, I think that the team feels more comfortable, and with the crowds that we've seen recently with some passion behind them,
Right.
Has been an important factor as well.
I'll also say, like, it's been for the last 2 years, Arthur Smith has made a point to not just the media but to the players themselves that, like, we want to make Mercedes-Benz a place that people fear coming and playing in. We want to be good at home. That's something we very viciously care about, is being good at home. So you have 2 home games coming up.
And
Be vicious.
yeah,
Don't
and
slide backward.
Yeah.
Right.
Forward.
Yeah.
and have a chance to kind of end this 2-game losing streak, stay above 500, keep the pressure on the entire NFC South, which started really hot and is kind of falling back into more of a pack. So I think this is a really good evaluation of where the Falcons are, sitting at 2-2, what's going well and what needs to get better. Tori, Terrin, thank you so much for joining us here as we are heading towards the second quarter, for lack of a better term, of this season. Thank you so much to Zaxby's for an awesome lunch and for being the presenting sponsor of the Falcons Final Whistle podcast. So now that we're wrapped up, do what you do. Rate, review, subscribe to the Atlanta Falcons Podcast Network on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Please give a subscription to our YouTube page. Not only are there cool podcasts like Falcons Audible, Falcons in Focus, and this one, I mean, our video team is just like the greatest thing ever,
Yeah.
right? So please check out all the content, and we will talk to you after the Texans game on Sunday. See ya.